YouTube as well. And we are live! Hello everybody and welcome to Mishnah Mastery! It feels like it's always ages since we get the chance to sit together and learn. But here we go. We are going to continue forward with 2 chapters tonight. We're going to try and do chapter 3 and we're going to try and do chapter 4 as well. So here we go. Without further ado, let's get ourselves comfortable. Get ourselves a nice cup of tea or coffee in a love mug, and let's get ourselves underway. Oh, a Snoopy mug, okay. And let's get underway with Masechet Temurah, chapter 3. We can hopefully all see the words on the screen over there, and hopefully that's all clear. So here we go, chapter 3. We are talking about what happens to an animal that gets sanctified through Temurah. So if we remember, Temurah was the concept of substituting an animal once it had been designated as a korban. So we weren't allowed to do this, but sometimes it would be the case that another animal would be substituted in place for that one. And the question is, what happens to those animals once we start to get into this substitutional mess? So here we go. We're going to go through different possibilities and different permutations of things that could happen. Some of the questions that one would have to keep in mind are, what happens if you have a particular type of sacrifice? Let's say we're going to be starting with a shlamim. So what happens if you have a shlamim of one gender and then you substitute it for an offering of another gender? And what if it's a korban which could have only been from one gender, and then when the substituted animal comes along, it's actually of a different gender? So all these different types of things, permutations and whatnots, we're going to be exploring together. So Mishnah Aleph of chapter 3, starting with the easiest, we're going to start with the shlamim. So shlamim could be both male and female, as in 2 different animals. You can either bring a male shlamim or you could bring a female shlamim. And so fundamentally, regardless of whatever the original korban was, you could substitute it for one of the other type. So it says the Mishnah, Elu kadashim shevaldotehen utmoratehen kayotze behen. These are the sacrifices for which their offspring and their temurah, their substitutes, could be like them. So the Mishnah starts, Vlad shlamim, when you have the offspring of a peace offering, utmuratan, and their substitutes, uvlad vladan ad saf haolam, and any generation of their offspring, of the original and of the substitute. So if the substitute animal was female and had offspring, hare elu kashlamim, these could all be brought as shlamim. They all have the sanctity of a shlamim, which would mean that they have to be processed as a shlamim. Utunim smicha unasachim utnufa v'chazei v'shok, which would mean that they should all have smicha done to them as part of the process, resting the hands on the head of the animal, unasachim, and they should all have libations brought with them, utnufa v'chazei v'shok, and the breast and the right back leg should be given to the kohen for waving. So as long as the offsprings are born before the animal is brought and after it's been consecrated as a shlamim, so then their offspring are going to have the same dinim, the same treatment required as a shlamim. Says Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Vlad shlamim lo yikrav shlamim. The offspring of shlamim should not be offered up as offspring. He says that although biblically it might be the case that they could be, we are worried that the owner might try and exploit the situation. And so therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says we shouldn't bring subsequent generations as sacrifices. And therefore, he would say that they should all be left to develop a blemish and die. V'chachamim omrim, the chachamim say, yikrav. They say that it can be brought. Now, what this means for the chachamim really is that one generation of offspring could be brought, but not subsequent generations. Says the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, Lo nechleku al vlad vlad shlamim v'al vlad vlad truma temurah shelo yikrav. So Rabbi Shimon says that the chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer agree fundamentally that the subsequent generations, the subsequent levels of offspring, would not be brought. So what do they argue about? They only argue about the initial first generation offspring. Rabbi Eliezer lo yikrav. Rabbi Eliezer says you wouldn't bring it; it would have to be left to die. Chachamim omrim yikrav. The chachamim say that animal could be brought. Hey, Rabbi Yeshua Rabbi Papias. Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Papias testified. Al vlad shlamim sheyikrav shlamim. They testify that the halacha should be like the chachamim, that the initial generation, first generation of offspring, should be brought. Amar Rabbi Papias. Rabbi Papias said, "Ani ma'id." Am I in the right place there? Shahaita lanu para zivchei shlamim va'achalnuha b'Pesach va'achalnu v'lada shlamim b'Chag. So Rabbi Papias says not only that, but there was a case during my lifetime where the offspring of a peace offering. So they had a para zivchei shlamim. They had a par which was a shlamim, and the cow itself, the shlamim itself, va'achalnuha b'Pesach. It was eaten as a shlamim on Pesach. Va'achalnu velada, and we ate its offspring, which would mean that this animal gave birth after the animal was already holy, but before it had been killed. So the offspring was eaten on Chag. It was eaten on a different festival. Whether that was Sukkot or Shavuos, I believe it was Shavuos, and obviously a month would have passed since the birth of this animal to be able to have done so. So that was what Rabbi Papias testified to having occurred in his lifetime, which means that the halacha is like the chachamim, because the chachamim said that first generation of offspring could be brought. Mishnah base. We move on to another example, another type of korban. So, Vlad Toda Utmarata, when it comes to the offspring of a Thanksgiving offering and its substitute, so the Mishnah is going to tell us that it's essentially the same as a shlamim. There's just a couple of differences. So, Vladan uvlad vladan ad sof ha'olam. So, the offspring and the offspring of the offspring are, until the end of time, are going to be like a korban toda. Hare elu katoda. They are going to be like a korban toda. Now, a korban toda, Thanksgiving offering, would be eaten for 1 day and 1 night after the sacrifice had been processed. A shlamim was for 2 days and 1 night. And not only that, but for a full-fledged Thanksgiving offering, you would bring 40 loaves of bread with it. So the Mishnah says, Hare elu katoda, they get processed like a Thanksgiving offering. They get treated like that in the sense that you have a day and a night to be able to eat it. But they wouldn't have 40 loaves brought with it. So a toda can be male or female, and it's a voluntary offering, and it can be subject to Temurah. But when you bring the substituted toda, you don't bring the 40 loaves with it. And the reason for that is because the verse implies that it should only be brought for the original offering. Continuing on in the Mishnah, Temurah's Ola, looking now at the Ola offering, the offering that would be completely burnt up. So an Ola should only be male. And therefore, we're going to see that the Temurah should also be male in order to be brought. So even though you could substitute it for a female, it would not then be brought as an ola. And because a female cannot be brought as an ola, there's no such thing as offspring of a korban ola. So Temurah's ola, with the substitutes of ola, uvavlad Temurah, and the offsprings of that substituted animal, because the substitute can be female, it's not supposed to be, but it could therefore have offspring. Vlad uvlad vladan ad sofa olam hare eluka ola. So then these should all be treated like a korban ola. Says the Mishnah, ut'unin hefshet, and therefore it would require to have its skin stripped off, vinitoach, and to be cut into large pieces, and it would then all be given to the Kohanim, v'chalil la'ishim, and then the whole thing should be burnt up on the Mizbeach as a korban ola. So even though it shouldn't have been done, even though an ola should not really be female, nonetheless the substitutes would have all been treated like a korban ola. Mishnah Gimel, hamafrish nekeva la'ola v'yalda zachar. So if one was to designate an animal, a female animal, to be an ola, so as we said, the korban ola can't be female. So what should happen? So you've designated a nekeva as female animal as an ola. V'yalda zachar, it's given birth to a male offspring. Says the Mishnah, yireh ad she'ista'ev. So you should leave the female animal, which can't be brought as an ola. You leave that in the field to graze. V'macher, and then you would sell it, and then v'yavi b'damav ola, and then you would use the money that you get for that animal. You would bring an ola in its place. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, hu atzmo yikrav ola. Rabbi Eliezer says the offspring of this female ola could be brought as the ola. Hamafrish nekeva la'asham. If you were to separate and designate a female animal for an asham, for a guilt offering, again, these should also only be males. There's no form of a female asham, and because it's not a voluntary offering, there would be no substitute that you could do. So the Mishnah says, Tireh ad shistayev, so you leave it in the field to graze, v'timacher v'yavi b'dameha asham, so you would sell it and bring the proceeds as a korban asham. Im karav ashamo, if you were to if you were to bring a korban asham during that time in its place, yiplu dameha lenadava, then the money that you get from the sale of the female animal would be allocated for voluntary sacrificial purposes. Rabbi Shimon Omer timachesh shelo b'mum, and Rabbi Shimon says since the female is not going to be able to be brought as a guilt offering, so then he says it should be sold without a blemish, and then another animal should be bought with that money in its place. Temurah's asham, says the Mishnah. What about the substitutes of a korban asham? So now having a look again at the Temurah of an asham, Vlad Temurasa. Uvavladan vladan ad sofa olam. So the substitute of a guilt offering and the offspring of that substitute of many generations, so they should be left in the field to graze until they become unfit for purpose, and then they can be sold, and then the proceeds of that money can go towards nadava, can go towards communal voluntary offerings. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yamutu. Rabbi Eliezer says differently. Rabbi Eliezer says they did have some kind of sanctity, even though they can't be brought, and therefore they have to be left to die. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Rabbi Elazar says, Yavi b'dmehem olos, that you can use this the money. They don't have to be used for communal voluntary offerings, but they could be used to fund the purchase of a korban ola. Asham shemetu ba'alav. If you had a guilt offering where the owner of this offering died before it had been brought. So because it would be linked and tied to a particular owner as a kapara for mistakes made, v'shekipru ba'alav. So you've got this this owner has died, and the guilt offering, the owner of this animal has managed to bring a separate korban, which has given him atonement. So what do you do with this original asham? So the Mishnah says you leave it to graze until it becomes unfit, then you sell it, and then you use that money to buy new offerings. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yamusu. Rabbi Eliezer says it should be killed. Rabbi Elazar, so that it should be left to die. Rabbi Elazar Omer Yavi b'dmeihem olos. Rabbi Elazar says again that the money can be used to purchase korban olos. Mishnah Daled. The difference between public ola and a private ola. So the Mishnah says, "V'halo af hanadava olahi." So the Mishnah, objecting now to what we've been saying, isn't a nadava, a gift offering, also a burnt offering, which is the opinion of the Chachamim. So the Mishnah says, "Ma bein divrei Rabbi Elazar la divrei Chachamim." So what would be the difference between what Rabbi Elazar was saying in the previous Mishnah about money being used to fund a korban ola, and the Chachamim who was saying that the money could be used to fund voluntary offerings? They can be one and the same thing. So what should the difference between their words be? Ella, rather, says the Mishnah, Bizman shehi ba'achova, at a time when an ola is being given out of a compulsion, out of an obligation, hu samech aleha, so then you would do smicha on this animal, you would rest your hands on it, umevi aleha nesachin, you would bring the libations with it, unesacheha mishelo, and the libations should be purchased through the funds of that individual who has the obligation to bring that particular korban ola. But v'im haya kohen, and if it was a kohen who was bringing an obligatory korban ola, avodasa v'ora shelo, so then he would have the right to do the work, he would have the right to do the avoda on it, and he would have the right to keep the skin. Uvizman shehi ba'nadava, but if the ola was being brought as a voluntary offering, eino samech aleh, then you wouldn't do smicha on it, ve'eino mevi aleh nesachim, and you wouldn't bring the libations, and the libations could be funded by the funds of the community. And afal pishu kohen, and even though it was a kohen who might be bringing this korban ola, nonetheless, avodasa va'ora shalan mishmar, the service of the process of the avodah done for this animal, and the skin which would have to be divided up amongst the kohanim, that would go to the anshe mishmar, that would go to the kohanim who were working that week in the Beis Hamikdash. Mishnah Hey, talking now as we approach the end of chapter 3, talking about the Bechor, firstborn offerings, and Maaseh, and the tithed, every 10th animal that would be brought as a korban as well. So what about them when it comes to the Temurah? So these are lower level sacrifices. And so there are going to be different things that would apply to these animals. First of all, a Bechor and a Maaser, they can't be brought voluntarily. They are obligatory. If they fit the criteria, then they are going to be given those designations. And the second interesting feature about them, even though they are a lower level sacrifice, is that they can't be redeemed. And if they were to get blemished, then they would have to be processed and dealt with in a particular way. So because it's not voluntary, and because they have to be fulfilling certain criteria to be designated as such, they have to be a firstborn animal, or they have to be the 10th animal to have been counted. So therefore, you can't bring a substitute for them. So you can't just infuse this status onto these animals. So a Bechor, a firstborn animal, which can only be male. Maaser, the 10th animal, which can be male or female. It's going to be different, perhaps, with how the halacha applies. So the Mishnah says, Temuras habachor v'hamaaser. When it comes to the substitutes of a bachor, or the substitutes of a tithed animal, uva vlad vladan ad sofa olam, and the offspring of these animals. So, maaser, it could be a female, and therefore there could be offspring of these animals. So the Mishnah says, Hare elu kabachor v'chamaaser. They would have to be eaten with the stringencies of a blemished bachor maaser. V'ye'achlu b'mumam l'ba'alim, and they would be eaten with their blemishes by the relevant owners. So the bechor would be given to a kohen, the maaser would be given to the owner, but that's the starting point. But then, when any korban would get a blemish, so you could redeem that animal and you could get another animal, but you can't redeem bechor and maaser, and so therefore they get eaten with greater stringencies. They have to be eaten like they were these blemished animals, because there's no way that they could be brought. So the Mishnah asks now, Ma bein habachor v'hamaaser lebein kol hakodashim. So what is the difference really between the firstborn offerings, the tithe offerings, and all other sacrifices? So the Mishnah says, Shekol hakodashim nimkarim ba'itlis, because all sacrifices could be sold at marketplace. V'nishchatin ba'itlis, and they could be slaughtered in the marketplace. V'nishkalim b'litra, and they could be weighed in a regular way, weighed and sold in a regular way. Chutz min ha-bechor u'min ha-maaser, except for a bechor and a maaser. V'yesh lahem pidyon, and other ones could be redeemed. They could be subject to redemption. V'litmuretein pidyon, and their substitutes could be subject to redemption. Chutz min ha-bechor u'min ha-maaser, except for bechor and maaser, because these things can't be redeemed. Ubayim mechutz la'aretz, and other sacrifices could be brought from outside of Eretz Yisrael. Chutz min ha-bechor min ha-maaser, except for bechor and maaser, because these things had to come from within Eretz Yisrael. In ba'u tamimim yikravu, if sacrifices were to be brought in an unblemished state, then they could be sacrificed in the Beis Hamikdash. But if they were blemished, then their owners would be eating them in a blemished state. Whether if it's a bechor, it would go to a kohen. If it was maaser, it would go to the owner. Amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, Ma'atam, what's the reason for this final difference? Shabachor v'maaser yesh lahem parnasa b'mekomam. Because the firstborn animal and the tithed animals, says here, have a remedy in their place outside Eretz Yisrael. You don't have to bring them to Eretz Yisrael. So there's a way around how you would, there's a way of dealing with them in their place without having to bring to Eretz Yisrael. Bushar kol hakadshim, and other sacrifices, afal pi shenolad lahem mum harei elu b'kedushasan. But when it comes to these other sacrifices, if they develop a blemish, then these animals would remain with their sanctity. One would redeem them. One would bring another korban in their place with the money that you got. And therefore, because of that, it makes sense to bring them still to Eretz Yisrael, because you can go and redeem them and fund a new korban on account of that money that you make from the sale. If you understood all of that, congratulations, and I wish you a double mazel tov on completing chapter 3 of Maseches Temurah. Not the easiest, guys, but we're sticking it out there, and that's to be commended. Let's move on to chapter 4 of Maseches Temurah after a commercial break where I blow my nose. Here we go. Perek Dalet. Talking about the substitutes of a korban chatas. So there's different types of chatas and different things that would have to happen depending on the what happens to a korban chatas. First of all, you've got vlad chatas. You've got the offspring of a sin offering. Utmuras chatas. You've got substitutes of a sin offering. Chatas shemesi baleha. You could have a chatas where the owner has died. And so how is it supposed to atone for his sin if the person who's committed the sin is now no longer in the world? So the Mishnah says, Yamusu, all of these different types of chata'ot, have to be left to die. Says the Mishnah, she'avra shenasa, if you've got a chatas which is now too old to be sacrificed, it's older than a year, v'she'avda, or it has been lost, v'nimtzeis balas mum, and it has so it gets lost, and when you find it, you discover that it was blemished. So the Mishnah says, Im mishikipru haba'alim tamus. If the owner has otherwise achieved atonement, then this animal should be left to die. Ve'ena osa temurah, and it can't be exchanged for a substitute. Lo nehenin, it can't be benefited from. V'lo ma'alin, and you also can't violate me'ilah. There's no violation of misappropriating temple property tied to this animal. If the owners have not yet achieved any atonement, then the Mishnah says, so then you have to leave it in the field to graze, and then that would then be sold in its blemished state, and the money would go towards another korban chatas, Temurah, and at that point, once this new animal has been bought, then the original animal could be subject to Temurah. And it could also be subject to misappropriation of Me'ilah. All very straightforward. Mishnah base. Hamafresh chataso, a person who designates a korban chatas, va'avda, and it gets lost. Let's scroll down. And it gets lost. V'hikriv acheres tachteha, and so the owner comes along and offers up an alternative sacrifice in its place. V'achar kach nimtzeis harishona, and after that, the original animal gets found, but the owner has already achieved atonement because he's brought a second animal. So what's going to happen to the first one? So very straightforwardly, the Mishnah says, Thomas, the first korban gets left to die. Hamafrish ma'os lachatas. A person separates money, designates money which he is going to use to buy a korban chatas. Va'avdu, and that money gets lost. V'hikriv chatas tachtehen, and he goes and brings an alternative chatas in its place. Va'achar kach nimtzu hama'os, and afterwards he finds the money that he had designated for sacrificial purposes. So what's going to happen with that money? What would the equivalent be of leaving money to die? So the Mishnah says, Yechu leyam hamelach. We see this a few times across Shas. You throw the money into the Dead Sea, which is an expression to indicate that this money should be disposed of. Nobody is allowed to have any benefit from it. So that is what is supposed to happen with money in that instance. Mishnah Gimel, our final Mishnah for this evening. No, that's wrong. Our second to final Mishnah for this evening. It's a long one though. So, it says the Mishnah, Hamafrish ma'os lechatasa. You designate money for korban chatas. Va'avdu, and that money gets lost. V'hifrish ma'os acherin tachtehen, and then you go and designate more money to spend on a korban chatas. Lo hispik likach bahen chatas, but before he gets to spend that money, ad shanimtzu amas arishanas, he finds the first money. So now he's got two bundles of money which have been designated for buying a korban chatas. So the Mishnah says, Yavi me'elu chatas, so you should combine this money together and use this money as much as you can to buy an appropriate korban chatas. Vashar yiplu lanadavar, and all the rest of the money that's left over should be put towards nadava, voluntary offerings. That's one case where, fundamentally what's happening is that we're going to see four cases where, I think if I'm not mistaken, where you're using both of the designated things, either the designated animal or the designated money. So here, both of those designated monies are going to be put towards combined together to go towards one korban chatas. So that was the first case. The second case, hamafrish ma'os lechataso, person designates money, va'avdu, and then he loses it. V'hifrish chatas tachtehen, and then he designates another chatas in its place. So the first one was money, and now he's designating an animal. Lo hispik lahakriva, but before he could bring the korban, ad shaninsu hamaos, he finds the money. V'hare chatas balas mum, and this second designated animal is blemished. So the Mishnah says, Timacher, sell the animal, Viyavi me'elu chatas. And now you've got two bundles of money, combine the monies together, and use that money to buy korban chatas, Vashar yiplul nadava. And the rest of the money goes towards a voluntary offering. The third case is going to be an animal being designated, followed by money. Hamafrish chatasa, you designate an animal for a chatas, Va'avdan, it gets lost, V'hifrish ma'os tachtehan, then you designate money in its place. Lo hispik likach bahen chatas. But before you get the chance to go and buy the second chatas, ad shenimtzeis chataso, you found the original one. V'harei hi balas mum, and it's blemished. Timacher, so you should sell it. V'yavi me'elu chatas, and use that money to buy korban chatas together, combine the money. V'ashar yiplul nadava. And then the rest of the money goes towards a voluntary offering. And the fourth case, hamafrish chataso, you designate an animal, va'avdan, it gets lost, v'hifrish acheres tachteha, and so you designate another animal in its place, lo hispik lakriva, but before you could bring the second animal, ad shenintse sarishona, you find the first one, v'areish tein balas mum, and actually both of these animals are blemished, so neither of them could be brought to the as a korban. Yimachu, you sell both of them. V'yavi me'elu chatas, and you combine the money together to buy another chatas. V'ashar yiplul nadavar, and you use that money to buy a voluntary offerings. Hamafrish chataso, you designate a korban chatas. V'avdan, it gets lost. V'hifrish acheres tachteha, and then you designate a second one in its place. Lo hispik la'akriva, you haven't had a chance yet to bring the second one. Anshanimtse sarishona, and you find the first one. V'harei shtehen tamimos. And in this case, both of these animals are unblemished. They could both be brought as a korban chatas. So the Mishnah says, Achas mehen tikrav chatas. One of them should be brought as a korban chatas, v'ashniya tamus, and the second one should be left to die. Divrei Rabbi. That is the opinion of Rabbi. Rabbi says you can bring either, but you can only bring one, and the other one has to die because you will have achieved atonement from the processing of one animal, and so you can't now bring the other one as a korban. The Chachamim say, Ein chatas mesa ela shenimtzeis ma'achar shekipru abalim. You can only put a korban chatas to death if the owners have only if you find and discover this other animal after the owners had achieved atonement. In other words, a korban chatas cannot be left to die unless it was found after the owner had achieved atonement. So if the first wasn't there and the second one was brought, then the first would be put to death. But if you have both of them where they're both unblemished, so then you can bring one, and then you have to leave the other one to develop a blemish, and then you can redeem it, and then you can give that money to the Beis HaMikdash. That's the opinion of the Chachamim. So Chachamim say, "Ein chatas meisa ela shenimtzeis me'achar shekipru abalim." A korban chatas would only be left to die if it was discovered after the owners had achieved atonement. Ve'ein hama'os hochos le'am hamelach, and money would only be disposed of in a similar instance. Ela shenimtzu me'achar shekipru abalim. Only if the owner had already achieved atonement. Otherwise, you would redeem that money and use it towards something else. Mishnah Dalet, to finish off Perek Dalet and to finish off for this evening. So when a chatas develops a blemish, so it should be sold and used to, the money should be used to buy a new one. But when you do this, the first animal becomes an animal that used to be a chatas, the owner would be getting his atonement, his kapara, by the second one, but the first, in this case, the first is still chulin before the kapara is finalized, before the atonement gets done. So something's going to happen before the second offering gets brought. So hamafrish chataso, person designates a korban chatas, v'harehi ba'alasmim, and it develops a blemish. Mochra, it should be sold. V'yavi b'dameha acheres, and then you use that money to bring another one. So Rabbi would say, if the second one gets killed before the first one is redeemed, then you could still get kapara from the second one, and you could then use the first. But Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon says, Im karva hashniya ad shalon nishnechata harishona, if the second one was brought before the first one was slaughtered, then he would say tamus. Then the first one has to be left to die. So in other words, the first one has a blemish, it has to be sold, and then another korban has to be brought. The first one then becomes chulin, it gets desanctified, and so it could be processed it could be slaughtered for other purposes. But, says Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon, if the second animal gets sacrificed before the first animal could be used for non-sacred purposes, he would say tamus, it should be killed. Shekvar kipru habalim, because since it had not been used yet as desanctified animal, so the owner has now achieved atonement with this second animal, and so according to him, you can't use this animal now for non-sacred purposes, whereas according to the first opinion, you would be able to do so. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we say Mazel Tov on completing chapter 4 of Temurah. If you didn't catch it all on this round, then we'll get it right the second time. But Mazel Tov nonetheless, and that's all for this week. And we'll see you next time on